Welcome back. Our course will be shifting now into the literature of the Pilgrims. This will be the first of many time hops, especially in the first half of our course, where we will be jumping, decades forward and moving from one group or one cluster of texts to another influential cluster of texts. We'll be focusing on the literature of the Pilgrims and the Puritans. There's a difference, and we'll talk about the difference between the two in just a moment. But they're not the only groups that are in the process of relocating across the Atlantic from Europe to these colonies in the Americas, but they are one of the most literarily influential groups. And so they're going to get a strong focus here in the early portion of the development of American literature. And I think what you'll find as we take a look at selections from William Bradford and John Winthrop, Anne Bradstreet, Mary Rowlandson, and so forth, that there's a strong influence that has cascaded down from the Pilgrims and Puritans into our own thinking about our national purpose, the philosophy that governs who we are, and also the literary traditions and the intellectual history of the United States. It's impossible to read John Winthrop's sermon, A Model of Christian Charity, and not think of how important Winthrop's ideas were in much of the rhetoric of the 1980s in America. President Ronald Reagan used key ideas from this sermon to help characterize his view of what America is or what America could be. And so there's a strong literary tradition that has cascaded down through the years, and even words like Puritan to describe someone's approach to cultural issues or perhaps sexual issues or gender dynamic issues is something that we still have as part of our culture today. What I want to do in these discussions on Puritan literature, though, is really try to establish what was the Puritan philosophy and to do some close reading of Puritan works. So, as always, we'll be using the Norton Anthology of American Literature, Volume A. We're using the 10th edition this term. And we'll be taking a look at selections from Bradford and Winthrop and Bradstreet over the next couple of class sessions. So let's start first by defining our terms. When we talk about Puritans and we talk about Pilgrims, who are we talking about, or what are we talking about? The key moment in the development of this is in the 1500s with the emergence of the Protestant Reformation. This is the fracture that happens to the Christian church in Europe, where we have a split of Catholicism and a newly developed line of Protestantism. There are many Protestant denominations, and you might be familiar with some of them as they exist today, denominations like the Baptists and the Presbyterians and the Methodists and the Lutherans and so forth. Some have closer affinities to the church as it was in England with the development of the Church of England. Some don't. And there's a wide variety of Protestant denominations. What happens in the 1500s as well in England is the formation of the Church of England. And the Church of England, which still exists, is an Anglican Christian church. And there are a group of deeply religious individuals in England who believed that the Church of England had not gone far enough in shaking free of the Catholic tradition, the traditions and the ideas and the theology of the Catholic Church. This group came to be known as the Puritans. So we have the Protestant Reformation and the formation of the Church of England, and we have a group called the Puritans. And of course, true to their name, Puritan, the focus is on trying to purify the Church of England of its characteristics that reminded them too much of Catholicism, the structure of the church in Catholicism, headed by a pope and bishops, the traditions, the theology, and so forth. So we have this group of Puritans, and they are, in many respects, a separatist group. Some of them are a separatist group. Others want to try to work within the Church of England and bring about evolutions and reformations inside their own church. But we also have a subset that are a more radical group. That is the group that we tend to think of as the Pilgrims. And the term comes from William Bradford, one of the authors who we'll be considering this week. And he takes the term from the Geneva Bible, an English translation of the Bible, and associates his group with the Israelites and their journeys and their struggles and their relationship with God. At first, these Puritans are divided on strategy for reforming the Church of England. But a subgroup, as I mentioned, emerges that later are called the Pilgrims. They don't identify as such as that's happening in the moment, but they leave England and they seek refuge in the Netherlands, in Holland, specifically in a university town called Leiden. And then while there, tensions are existing between the Dutch and other powers in Europe. There's some feelings that Dutch culture might be too loose for this group of sort of stalwart, die-hard, very fundamentalist Christians. And there's a sense in which they want to get out of the Netherlands and they want to go somewhere else. They work with John Smith, who is exploring in the Virginia area of the colonies, to help secure a land grant in the Americas. And they're going to move from the Netherlands to the Americas. In the traditional telling of the story, this is all about religious independence. And that's a key part of what is motivating the Pilgrims. But there's also an idea that they would be able to set up their own colony, their own community, with their own economy, and it could be a business venture as well. Not just something doing for religious reasons, but also a sense of being able to create a new homeland with a new home-based economy and the ability to sustain themselves. These are the individuals who set sail on the Mayflower. You may be familiar with that famous ship. And they arrive, they're headed for Virginia, but instead they arrive in Plymouth, Massachusetts. And they take up residence in what is known as New England. Time, of course, for these early settlers is very difficult. They land in the winter, there are storms on the seas, they are also met with the Native Americans as they land, and relationships start well and then they deteriorate and then they go back and it kind of moves back and forth. There's illness, there's sickness, there's starvation. There are a lot of challenges. And many of those challenges are documented, I think, for a particular reason and effect by Bradford in his text from our anthology that we read for this week of Plymouth Plantation. So we're going to turn to Bradford's text and take a look at it. But before we get way too deep into the text, I want to talk a little bit about the theology of the Puritans and the theology of the group that we might think of as the Pilgrims. These are, as I mentioned, a fundamentalist group of Christians. And they are also Calvinists. The term comes to us from the theologian John Calvin, who had a very influential set of ideas regarding Christianity. And part of Calvinism is the idea of predestination, that God knows all, that God controls all, that God knows everything that you're already going to do, and it's predestined to happen. Also central to this idea is the idea of the elect. So God has already chosen those who are going to go to heaven and those who will not. It's been predetermined from the start of time. Now this raises some thorny theological issues that many thinkers and writers grapple with about, well, is there such a thing as free will in a system of predestination? And if you already know that you're saved, is there anything that you can do that would prevent you from being saved? You know, for instance, if you are part of the elect and you are going to heaven, what is the incentive to do anything that's good if you already know that you're going, right? This is a sort of paradox inside the thinking. And this is explained through a variety of ways. You know, somebody who might be tempted to have that attitude, right? Well, I'm already elect. I'm already going to heaven. What I do on earth doesn't matter. I can be selfish. I can be cruel. I can be greedy. I can be licentious, so on and so forth. The thinking goes that that person is not the type of person who would be elect. So there's a strong Calvinist theology that runs through the Puritans, a strong sense of the challenges that lie ahead for people. And we see that really on display in Bradford's text. So what I want to do is try to bring to life some of these ideas or related concepts of the Puritan theology as we see them being displayed in Bradford's text. Of Plymouth Plantation began as a journal for Bradford, and many years later was revised into a history of the Plymouth colony, the arrival of the Pilgrims in New England. As such, I want us to be thinking about a few things with a text like that. Modeled on notes but revised later means we should, as we've asked for other texts in the course, what is part of the agenda? What is part of the purpose of this text? How is this text functioning in terms of a piece of rhetoric? We also want to think about the fact that Bradford and the other Puritans, because they believed so much in predestination, everything happens under the control of what God wants to happen, then everything is subject for interpretation. No detail is too small. Anything that happens is because it was willed to happen. Therefore, we should be looking in the text at moments that draw our attention to things that happened that are either strange or unique or shocking or surprising or terrifying, because Bradford would have thought of it as this is what God wants to be happening, and it is our job to try to make sense of it. This is happening to us. Why? How can we connect what is happening to us to God's plan for us? The other idea that I want us to keep in mind relates to what is sometimes called the Puritan style. The Puritan style. The idea here is that the central text for the Puritans was the Bible, unsurprisingly. They have a skeptical eye toward more imaginative literature. There's not much of a need for something like fiction, which might be equated to lies, in a world where devotion to the Bible is of the utmost importance. There's also a prevailing idea in Puritan theology of following the Bible literally, and there's a skepticism toward graven images or showy shrines to God, and there's a plainness that is often associated with the Puritan style. If you have the image in your mind of somebody dressed very plainly in a singular color, perhaps black and white, or a hat with a very plain structure to it, there's a plainness to the Puritan lifestyle that moves or shuns ornamentation and instead wants to focus on things as they are. And so from a literary perspective, the Puritan style is often said to be a kind of plainness to the language, with an emphasis on teaching or instructing. Right? The point of writing is to instruct. The point of writing is to deliver information, to be didactic. And there's also a sense here in glorifying God. Now, the glorification of God from the Puritan standpoint is also a bit of a challenge, because the Puritans have at their core an idea of total human depravity, that all humans are fallen, that all humans are sinful, that they will never be able to reach adequate level until they've ascended into heaven. And so how does one glorify God using the language of a fallen order? All language, all human language is corrupt, is sinful, because humans are sinful, and can a sinful language ever fully glorify God? So there are ways in which we want to keep a lookout for the ways that the Pilgrims try to glorify God, perhaps not directly, but certainly through the description of events that bring glory to God. There's also a skepticism toward figurative language, similes and metaphors, personification, things that are not literal. So when there is imagery, we can think of it as very literal imagery. And you'll see aspects of that on display. Okay. Let's turn to Bradford. Bradford opens his text by providing a bit of history, what has brought this group of Puritans to the place where they are, the place in Holland, and what they sought to do from that point onward. He says on page 131, about a third of the way down the page, the place they had thoughts on was some of those vast and unpeopled countries of America, which are fruitful and fit for habitation, being devoid of all civil inhabitants, where there are only savage and brutish men, which range up and down, little otherwise than the wild beasts of the same. Be mindful of the rhetoric here. Be mindful of the concept that before they've even left the Netherlands for the Americas, there's a perception in the mind about the types of people, if Bradford would really even call them that, right? The land is described as unpeopled, and the Native Americans are described as savages, though he does deign to use the word men to describe them, so at least we have some recognition of humanity here. But for the most part, from the perspective of Bradford, the Native Americans are largely inseparable from the animals that inhabit the world of the Americas. The proposition being made public and coming to the scanning of it all, it raised many variable opinions amongst men and caused many fears and doubts among themselves. Some, from their reasons and hopes conceived, labored to stir up and encourage the rest to undertake and prosecute the same. Others, again, out of their fears, objected against it and sought to divert from it, alleging many things, and those neither unreasonable nor unprobable, as that it was a great design and subject to many unconceivable perils and dangers, as besides the casualties of the seas, which none can be freed of, and the length of the voyage was such, as the weak bodies of women and other persons worn out with age and travail, as many of them were, could never be able to endure. And yet, if they should, the miseries of the land which they should be exposed unto would be too hard to be borne, and likely some or all of them together to consume and utterly to ruinate them. For there they should be liable to famine, and nakedness, and the want, in a manner of all things. The change of air, diet, and drinking of water would infect their bodies with sore sicknesses and grievous disease. And also those which should escape or overcome these difficulties should yet be in continual danger of the savage people, who are cruel, barbarous, and most treacherous, being most furious in their rage and merciless where they overcome. So on and so forth. There's also, he says later on in the line, it's going to be expensive, blah, blah. But the idea here is that it's a danger, it's a risk. But they do it anyway. Think of how this is functioning rhetorically, how the language is moving and the point that it's trying to make. By listing all of the perceived threats, Bradford is making sure that we understand how devoted they are to the cause. That in light of all these threats, they did it anyway. So there's a history being written here after the fact that's looking back and trying to create or shape, to reconstruct or revise the narrative. And that history itself can prove to be very influential in time as well. Let's turn now to the excerpt from chapter 9 of Plymouth Plantation. And this is where things really start to get interesting in terms of thinking about the role that providence plays, of predestination, and so forth. It's also, when we get to the nuts and bolts of it, the most imagistic portion of Bradford's text. And we mentioned the plain style, the Puritan plain style, and in many respects, I don't know that this can be described as plain. So what we might want to ask ourselves is, if we are known for a plainer, more direct, simpler style, ordinary style, then what's going on here if the text doesn't feel that way? Is it in fact plain, or is it something else? Chapter 9 opens with a relatively shocking anecdote. Let's take a look at it now. These troubles being blown over, and now all being compact together in one ship, they put to sea again with a prosperous wind, which continued divers days together, which was some encouragement unto them. Yet, according to their usual manner, many were afflicted with seasickness. And I may not omit here a special work of God's providence. There was a proud and very profane young man, one of the seamen, of a lusty, able body, which made him the more haughty. He would always be condemning the poor people in their sickness and cursing them daily with grievous execrations, and did not let to tell them that he hoped to help to cast half of them overboard before they came to their journey's end, and to make merry with what they had. And if he were by any gently reproved, he would curse and swear most bitterly. But it pleased God, before they came half seas over, to smite this young man with a grievous disease, of which he died in a desperate manner, and so was himself the first that was thrown overboard. Thus his curses lighted on his own head, and it was an astonishment to all his fellows, for they noted it to be the just hand of God upon him. So we have a shocking moment here in the language Bradford uses. Partly one of the reasons I think it feels a little shocking is that the language seems to relish in what has happened to this soldier. But we have a soldier who treats the Pilgrims, the Puritans in this case. Bradford's with the Puritans, and Winthrop and Bradstreet are with Bradford's with the Pilgrims, and Winthrop and Bradstreet are with the Puritans. We have a sense here of a delight or a relishing in God's justice that ends up smiting this sailor who treats them badly. It's a sense, a strange sense, I think, within the text of hope. Things are rough, but this figure who is sort of torturing and admonishing and reproving and generally berating the Pilgrims is struck down. A sign, right? Everything is a sign. Everything is interpretable as part of God's plan to the Puritans. So what does this mean? It can be seen as a sense of, I am with you. I am looking out for you. I am on your side. On page 138 and 139, we have some of the most sustained images that Bradford offers us. And now I would like to do a close reading with you of some of these passages and think a little bit about some of the literary choices that Bradford makes. Page 138, about a quarter of the way down, Bradford writes, "But after they had sailed that course about half the day, they fell amongst dangerous shoals and roaring breakers. And they were so far entangled therewith that they conceived themselves in great danger. And the wind shrinking upon them withal, they resolved to bear up against the cape, and thought themselves happy to get out of those dangers before night overtook them, as by God's providence they did." Then, in the next paragraph, "Being thus arrived in a good harbor and brought safe to land, they fell upon their knees and blessed the God of heaven, who had brought them over the vast and furious ocean, and delivered them from all the perils and miseries thereof, again to set their feet on the firm and stable earth, their proper element. And no marvel if they were thus joyful, seeing wise Seneca was so affected with sailing a few miles off the coast of his own Italy, as he affirmed that he had rather remained 20 years on his way by land than pass by sea to any place in a short time. So tedious and dreadful was the same unto him." This is interesting because we have a reference to a historical figure now, not pure narrative, but we're starting to bring in or variate a little bit from the style to start making some points. theological points. Bradford tells us, in your footnote explains it a little more, that the Roman Stoic philosopher Seneca was well known to have had seasickness and didn't like traveling by sea. So here you have this great Roman figure to be admired and to be revered, who did not like to travel by sea, and said in his preference that he'd rather a journey take 20 years on land than to get there a short time by sea. And yet, Bradford seems to be saying, Seneca thought he had it bad, or he thought that kind of journey was bad, but we've traveled across the entire Atlantic Ocean to get here. Look at what we have endured in the name of what we are trying to accomplish. So there's an element of contrast here, using a familiar moment and saying, if you thought that was difficult, you ain't seen nothing yet, right? What we have endured is the most difficult thing at all, and we've done it out of love, and we've endured it, and we've made it. That must reflect on God's providence in our favor. He continues, but here I cannot but stay and make a pause and stand half amazed at this poor people's present condition. And so I think the reader too, when he well considers the same. So now we have a great shift here in which Bradford is talking directly to us as readers. He's really drawing our attention to this. He's using this language to narrow us in to pay attention to something. Hopefully when you were reading this text, you had the feeling that he was drawing you in by using a sentence style and a point of view and a sense of narrowing that felt different than the rest of the text. He continues, being thus past the vast ocean and a sea of troubles before in their preparation, as may be remembered by that which they went before, they had now no friends to welcome them, nor inns to entertain or refresh their weather-beaten bodies, no houses or much less towns to repair to seek for succor. It is recorded in Scripture as a mercy to the apostle and his shipwrecked company that the barbarians showed them no small kindness in refreshing them. But these savage barbarians, when they met with them, as after will appear, were readier to fill their sides full of arrows than otherwise. And for the season it was winter. And they that know the winters of that country know them to be sharp and violent and subject to cruel and fierce storms, dangerous to travel to known places, much more to search an unknown coast. Besides, what could they see but a hideous and desolate wilderness full of wild beasts and wild men? And what multitudes there might be of them they knew not. Later, if they looked behind them, there was the mighty ocean which they had passed, and was now as a main bar and gulf to separate them from all the civil parts of the world. If it be said they had a ship to succor them, it is true, but what heard they daily from the master and company? And with that speed they should look out a place with their shallop, where they would be at some near distance. Bradford talks about their sad condition and their trials. And the line that I want to emphasize for you is approximately 2/3 down the page. What could now sustain them but the Spirit of God and His grace? Note here the way that we don't necessarily have a glorifying of God directly in language. There's not a sense here of trying to form poetry that explains how amazing God is. But it's sort of amazing through a process of elimination, right? Think about all of the horrible things that we have endured. All of the horrible trials, the dangers, right? The journey itself was a nightmare, but then when we got there, it was winter. And there were no inns and no homes. And we were met with people who didn't want us there, right? We endured all of these things. What comfort did we have? We had no comfort whatsoever, save one thing: the Spirit of God and His grace. So Bradford's trying to create this sense of how amazing the Spirit and providence of God is, how amazing the love of the grace is, through a sense of saying, look at all that we endured. There's nothing there for us. We were the most miserable lot possible, but we still have God. What follows then is a biblical citation. And it's interesting sometimes to think about, with the Puritans, what verses of the Bible they cite to help make the case that they're trying to make. Bradford cites the book of Deuteronomy. May not and ought not the children of these fathers rightly say, our fathers were Englishmen which came over this great ocean and were ready to perish in the wilderness, but they cried unto the Lord, and He heard their voice and looked on their adversity. Let them therefore praise the Lord, because He is good, and His mercies endure forever. Yea, let them which they have been redeemed of the Lord show how He hath delivered them from the hand of the oppressor. When they wandered in the desert wilderness out of the way and found no city to dwell in, both hungry and thirsty, their soul was overwhelmed in them. Let them confess before the Lord His loving kindness and His wonderful works before the sons of men. A citation of Deuteronomy, but also of Psalm 107. So the citation of the Bible here helps deliver Bradford's point. You can cite the Bible in terms of glorifying God, but showing how miserable the conditions were, Bradford is able to create a situation where he is able to argue through the benefit of hindsight, having survived as he and many others did, though they lost many others, that they were blessed or predestined to be able to do what they were doing. And that sense of destiny, that sense of control, that sense of God's blessing and grace upon those who would come to colonize and settle and move into the Americas is a strong and pervasive idea that runs through many of the European philosophies and thoughts and ideologies and theologies as part of the moving across the Atlantic and into the Americas. Bradford also in the text provides information regarding the relationship between the Pilgrims and the Native Americans, the ups and the downs of those relationships. In many of the same ways that Bradford delights in the death of the tormentor on the ship, who dies halfway across the journey and is the first one to die and is thrown overboard as a result of that. There are many passages in the text where there's a sort of disconcerting joy or glee with the illness and the ill-fatedness that befalls the Native Americans. I'm thinking about page 155 with how the Native Americans suffered under smallpox. Bradford also takes this moment not only to highlight the extent of the suffering of the native people under smallpox, but the kindness of the English who risk disease or risk other things to tend to the Native Americans. So there's always something where it's like, how does this fit into the overall story of our coming here? This bad thing, what did we do to deserve this, in a way that echoes much of the Christian Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, the sense of the elect, the chosen people. The Israelites are God's chosen people, and they are his people that he loves and he protects, but they are often falling short of his expectations, and there are consequences that befall them, and attempts to get back into line, back into God's graces through a changing of their ways, understanding what they did wrong, and so forth. Bradford also brings that perspective into the text as well. So as we think about Bradford's text on Plymouth Plantation and how it fits into the overall idea of the Puritan style, what I want to emphasize here is that the Puritan style was known for its plainness and its emphasis on teaching and glorifying God, on a focus of literal imagery as opposed to highly poetic or literary imagery. In fact, the Puritans would later retranslate the book of Psalms into a very plain style, trying to take away from it the sense of highly poetic ornamentation or literary license with the Psalms. Just give me the information straight. God is so great and gracious that he does not need our attempts to create ornate qualities in our language to honor him. And so think about the way that Bradford is doing that, and once you understand the context of the Puritan thought process, the Puritan theology, the Puritan approach, then you can take what you have learned from the historical context associated with the Puritans and to begin to ask yourself, how does a archetypal Puritan text like Bradford's of Plymouth Plantation embody the values that we see of the Puritan philosophy? That idea or that relationship between context and text will be an ongoing aspect of our course, where we will be thinking about and considering the way that texts fit in their moment, go with the literary moment, or perhaps push back against the literary moment. Those are always the really interesting ones, the ones that seem like they don't fit perfectly. They kind of do, but there's a little bit of tension kind of capped or kind of put in place. There's just something about it that doesn't quite work. Those are the moments of interesting artistic experiences that we can bring to light through literary discussions. So thinking about the context that surrounds the text, and then looking at the text and looking closely at the text to think, how does this text fit the historical moment? What are elements that I see on display? Why might the author have made the choices that the author makes? These are key strategies for being able to get into a text like this in a survey course and to be able to get the most out of it. We'll continue with John Winthrop and Bradstreet.